Welcome, nutritionradio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, a university nutrition professor of over 20 years, senior scientist, and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. This is its sister show, in fact, where you'll get condensed 10-minute topics alliteratively linked to the day of the week, so you can subscribe and tune in only for the daily subjects that interest you. We have Monday, market news from the food world, Tuesday, trends in science, Wednesday, weight management tips, Thinking Thursday, if you like lecture time, and Fitness Fridays. The specific content will vary according to news that comes across my desk. Come on in. Welcome, everybody, to episode number 2. Today's episode is for those of you that are interested in mental performance. It starts with a story, a personal story, and it leads toward something that almost looks like a nootropic or cognitive drug. Well, in fact, it is a drug that's also available as a supplement. So if you're not interested in COVID or long COVID, which is how this begins, stick around and you'll see how this might apply otherwise. It really opened this sort of rabbit hole that I went down. So the personal story is such that about a year ago, I got COVID, as did my wife, and even when the acute symptoms faded, I was left with a nasty brain fog that I had never felt before. This kind of thing, it just felt like a veil in front of my eyes and my brain. And being a scientist, that's not okay, right? When you have your mental functioning really fogged up, I mean, really profoundly so, then you can't do your job. So this actually is something that I just endured. I tried different pre-workout stimulant type things. I did whatever I could just to combat it with a moderate degree of success. But then a recent science trend popped up, and this trend is really starting at Yale University, the School of Medicine there. So let's get to that. Tuesday, trends in science. Here's the news piece from the Yale School of Medicine itself. Again, going to the horse's mouth. Yale School of Medicine, potential new treatment for brain fog in long COVID patients. Isabella Backman, just a few weeks ago here from mid-December. Individuals with long COVID, sometimes referred to as long haulers, experience symptoms that may persist for weeks, months, or even years after their acute viral infection. I feel like I should be raising my hand. While symptoms vary widely, a common complaint among patients is brain fog, quote unquote, a colloquial term for significant persistent cognitive deficits with consistent impairment of executive functioning and working memory. So if you're asking yourself what's executive function, that's typically just cognitive processes that help with planning, monitoring, and successfully executing your goals. At least that's one way to describe it from Psychology Today. But the point here is that is negatively affected. Long haulers may experience a lack of mental clarity, poor focus and concentration, memory problems, difficulty with multitasking, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a big problem, but we're going to march toward this drug-nutrient combination to treat it. So the study that came out used a fairly small number of patients, and Yale is quick to point out that this is far from being definitive, but it is very interesting. The drug is guanfacine, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, developed in the lab of Amy Arnsten. She's a PhD in neuroscience, and it was approved by the FDA in 2009 for ADHD, according to this news piece. It's also actually been promulgated through other news catchers, if you will, that I receive for hypertension, a blood pressure drug as well as an ADHD drug. But the Yale piece goes on to say that clinicians have also used it extensively off-label for other prefrontal cortical disorders, such as traumatic brain injury, so you might be familiar with TBI, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But now Arnsten is joining forces with this Armen Fesharakizadeh, an MD PhD who has been treating COVID patients with a combination of guanfacine and N-acetylcysteine, or NAC. And you may have heard about that in sports nutrition circles or dietary supplement circles in different ways. An antioxidant, also used for the treatment of traumatic brain injury. The combined therapy, they said, was successful in relieving brain fog in their small cohort of patients. And of course, they counsel that you need larger placebo-controlled clinical trials to really understand this better. They do go on to tell the origin story, if you will, of this Dr. Fesharaki. He recognized there was an overlap between the brain fog that his patients had in post-concussion settings. So he started with NAC for the long COVID brain fog, and it says which is commonly used to treat symptoms following concussions, and he noticed some partial benefits in energy and memory. Now, that's where my excitement starts to get kindled, but also where it stops, because I'm not going to be asking my physician for guanfacine or some other drug, but I am interested in the NAC thing, and we'll get there. It says since then, he's treated 12 patients experiencing post-COVID brain fog with this regimen, and he instructed patients to take 1 milligram of the guanfacine at bedtime, and if they tolerate that, go up to 2, etc., and then take 600 milligrams of NAC once a day. And when you look at typical doses, that's right in the middle of it. I actually have some in my supplement cabinet, 600 milligrams, but 600 to 1200, sometimes you'll see 1800 from a supplemental dose perspective. It said 8 patients reported substantial benefits, including improved memory, organizational skills, and ability to multitask. For some, the brain fog completely resolved. But some of the patients weren't able to continue. They left the investigation for dry mouth, different side effects. Nausea and vomiting are also potential side effects of taking NAC. Even low blood pressure. Again, other news outlets reporting it to be a blood pressure drug as opposed to more of a cognition or brain health type of drug. But before I get into a deep dive looking at some psychology-type articles to see where else NAC has been applied and what it does, what is it? Well, N-acetylcysteine is a precursor to the amino acid cysteine, or an old prof of mine used to say cysteine, because he's trying to designate that it's different from cysteine, which is spelled slightly differently. Cysteine is more stable. It's a dipeptide, 2 amino acids stuck together in your bloodstream. But when it gets in your cells, it's cysteine, and by itself, cysteine, and that amino acid is part of glutathione, which you might have heard it's a very central cellular antioxidant, which is actually itself a tripeptide. But the idea is you supply the NAC, which helps provide the building blocks for this important glutathione. In fact, it highlights how different antioxidant nutrients work differently. Antioxidants are a real Pandora's box when it comes to sports nutrition settings and other settings. They work differently. They do different things. And NAC is a good example of that. Like, it has mucolytic properties, so mucus thinner type properties. It's been used in a variety of settings. But at least now you get an idea what it is. It's a precursor to this dispensable, right, or non-essential amino acid. I guess you could say semi-essential amino acid, cysteine. And I'll show you here, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see how it differs in structure. But that's neither here nor there for most of us. Let's look at the psychology article here from David Hellerstein, MD. This is a 2018 paper from Psychology Today. NAC, the amino acid that turns psychiatry on its head. Research on NAC illuminates an old question. And I don't want to get off on a tangent. Essentially, he's exploring whether all psychiatric disorders are somehow linked, or are they really radically different things? But we want to focus on the NAC. So in this article, and again, you can look at this yourself, Psychology Today, you have the author. NAC is an over-the-counter compound that can be purchased at your local health food store. As with dozens, if not hundreds of other compounds, NAC has its devotees and its detractors. It's an amino acid, something present in many foods, he points out, but supplements give you a higher dose than you would get in your normal daily diet. He says it's taken typically in doses from 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams per day, usually in 600 milligram capsules, taken 2 to 3 times a day. He goes on to say the intriguing thing about NAC to him is that it's of great interest to neuroscience researchers. There's been many studies on the compound, including neuroimaging studies, and it's been investigated in innumerable disorders: depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, PTSD, schizophrenia, addiction, eating disorders, Alzheimer's. The list goes on. And it has established medical uses as an anti-inflammatory medicine for things like acetaminophen, right? Tylenol overdose. And don't get me started on Tylenol toxicity. But clinical trials have been promising in many, but not all disorders where they have looked at it. So this seems to be unique even in the world of antioxidants. Clearly, there's need for more clinical trials. Hellerstein wonders about the mechanism. He says, is it the result of anti-inflammatory effects, or is there something else going on a clinical level in day-to-day work with patients? NAC seems to help with ruminations, so repeatedly playing over something, often negative. And again, thoughts that are common in some of the disorders we talked about, anxiety, depression, OCD, etc. He says, I've seen it help patients with such disorders when many other things, medicines or psychotherapies, have not helped much. Very interesting. And if you're interested, I can provide a video through Lab Roots, which is one of the newscatchers I use, where they talk about the brain and inflammation and linking it all back to the fog of long COVID. In fact, I can also link to an abstract or two on the neuroprotective role of N-acetylcysteine, including some information about the bioavailability isn't great. But again, we're back to that 600 milligram, 1, 2, maybe 3 times a day. If you're interested in side effects, by all means, look them up online. Typically within these dose ranges, they're not extremely high, but you could be on other medications that interact and that sort of thing. So by no means am I telling you to do this. It's just fascinating news. But I see the clock is telling me that I am already out of time in this new 10-minute format. So by all means, follow up on the leads that I just provided. It's very interesting news. It's an unusual antioxidant that seems to do other things and have clinical applications, even sold as a drug. So very interesting stuff here on our Tuesday Trends in Science. We'll see you next time. The nutritionradio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.